And it's good. Okay. Good afternoon, officially.
Good afternoon.
So I'm glad that you could all take time from your pre-Passover preparations, which was harder to say than when it occurred to me in my mind, to come in and study a little bit. Now, obviously, we don't have a official Torah portion for the week because the weekly cycle is abbreviated, or not abbreviated, it's, what's the term, preempted by what we'll be reading for Pesach when we come to shul this coming Saturday and Sunday. Just like the following week when we also have a special service on Friday and Saturday for the end of Pesach. So we're going to get some different material today. We're also going to read from the Torah, but we're going to talk a little bit about how we do and why we do the Seder the way we do. We're not going to cover everything in the Seder because, well, that takes an entire evening. Instead, we're just going to look at a couple parts of the Seder. Everyone good? Okay. But to understand why and how we do the Seder, how we do, we've got to actually take a look at what the Torah tells us to do. So we're going to be on page 382.
Okay.
And we're actually going to pick up from 12:8. Because the part right before that is a little bit about the blood on the doorposts, which we don't do anymore because we don't actually have the angel of death to worry about. But the other parts of what we're describing here from our first Seder, indeed, has continued to be an ongoing part of our ritual. All right, now we're going to need a volunteer since our usual volunteer reader is back up north getting ready for her Seder.
I'll volunteer.
Thank you. So from 12:8, if you could.
They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs.
All right. So what did we just learn? Well, first of all, the flesh here is talking about the Passover sacrifice.
It's lamb.
It's lamb. Exactly.
Barbecue.
We're going to have a barbecue, right?
Roasted over fire.
Right. So the lamb had to be roasted, right? You roasted. I can spell English too, as opposed to boiled or some other form of cooking.
And we will have unleavened bread and bitter herbs.
And we have to have matzah, and we have to have maror, right? Which is the type of bread, the unleavened type, and the bitter herb. Okay, so those of you who are familiar with a traditional Seder, what did we just hit? Which part of
we certainly have the lamb bone, the shank on the Seder plate. We have the bitter herbs, and we have the matzah on the Seder plate. And those are the symbols of what happened.
Rabban Gamliel says that everybody who has the Seder must mention these three things. Boom. There's our verse right here. Right, so we don't get to actually have the lamb nowadays because that has been stopped since the destruction of the Second Temple and the loss of the altar. But the other two are still very much active of what we have in our Seder. But all three are mentioned during that part of the Seder ceremony, and they were mentioned precisely because we get one verse that tells us all three of these are the key symbols of the Seder. Right, the lamb that was used as part of our sacrifice, the matzah that was eaten as the unleavened bread, and the maror, the bitter herb. Good?
Is it forbidden today to have lamb chops for your Seder?
No. As a matter of fact, there were some communities that would eat lamb as a remembrance of the sacrifice. In some Sephardic communities in particular, because the Ashkenazim went the opposite direction. And they said, if you eat lamb, it won't be a remembrance, it will be mistaken as a fulfillment. That if you're eating the lamb, people will think it really was the lamb. This is why also in many Ashkenazi communities, when we get to this section of the Seder, where we are reminding ourselves of these three symbols, we will lift up the bitter herbs and say, this is the bitter herbs. We will lift up the matzah and say, this is the matzah. And when we get to the shank bone, we don't pick it up because it ain't the bone of the sacrifice. And if you were to pick it up and say, this is a reminder of the bone, a lot of people would skip the word reminder as they hear you, and they would think, oh, we're actually eating the sacrifice. And of course, that would be wrong because it's not the actual sacrifice. So yes, the Ashkenazim erred on the side of caution to prevent people from thinking we were having the sacrifice. You will never find lamb on an Ashkenazic Seder, or at least a traditional Ashkenazic Seder. But in other parts of the world, Sephardic and some of the Mizrahi communities, they had no problem because after all, lamb was central. And as long as everybody around the table knew it wasn't the sacrifice, then there was no issue. Make sense?
Yes.
Personally, I love lamb and would love to have it for my Seder, but I still hew to that Ashkenazic stringency on that particular part. Good? Good. Go ahead and keep reading keep reading about our eating.
Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in any way with water, but roasted, head, legs, and entrails over the fire.
Yep. Hey, you know, that's good eating there. What do you think sausages are made from?
I don't know.
That's why it's in the sausage. If you could identify it, they would have put it on the plate without the covering. Keep going.
Never watch how
You
they
shall
eat.
not leave any of it over until morning. If any of it is left until morning, you shall burn it.
Right. So from the actual sacrifice, there is no Tupperware. Once you have had your fill and you cannot eat the rest of the lamb, you don't get to store it and then eat it later. This has to be eaten only during the Seder time. This is not just a question of protecting the sanctity of it and prevent it from being eaten in states when you may not be ritually pure. This is also one of the key ingredients that would suggest to the community that when it is time and you and your family find yourself unable to eat an entire lamb yourself, you will invite more people together in order to have this Passover sacrifice. Indeed, the Torah itself mentions that, but the rabbis were very, very encouraging towards people who would eat the sacrifice together with lots of other people in order that nothing would go to waste and everyone would be able to partake of the sacrifice, even if they couldn't afford an entire lamb for the dinner for themselves and their families. So that little technical detail is actually quite instrumental in encouraging community celebration of this particular mitzvah. Make sense? All right. We are now going to skip a little bit of eating this quickly, and we are going to take a look at now jumping ahead to page 386 to verse 24, where we get that this is not a one-time only activity.
You shall observe this as an institution for all time, for you and for your descendants. And when you enter the land that the Lord will give you as he has promised, you shall observe this rite.
Right. Well, it's like, well, wait a minute. We're going to be doing this later? I mean, I thought this whole ritual was our celebration of leaving the slavery, right? Leaving bondage behind. This would be the equivalent of signing the Declaration of Independence again and again and again every July 4th. Right? Well, why would we do that? As a reminder, right?
Is it like signing the Declaration of Independence, or is it more like saying the Pledge of Allegiance?
Okay. So it definitely is confined to a particular date, unlike the Pledge of Allegiance.
Right.
But it is more like remembering aspects of the signing rather than actually declaring independence every single Pesach. So we're not going to be doing the painting of the blood around the door frame, as I already mentioned. But the other elements of the rite we are going to include, and we are going to also include a very specific instruction, which is what we're just about to hear.
And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, because he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but saved our houses.
All right, so we were doing the sacrifices, specifically called the avodah. And that is what our children will ask us about. In fact, if you are familiar with the Haggadah, that question makes it into the Haggadah. Who asks it?
Child, the youngest child.
The wicked child.
Oh, why are you doing this?
Well, so this is how we contextualize the question, right? The question is asked innocently within the Torah, right? The Torah simply says, your kids are going to ask you, what does this mean? And you're going to explain to them in the way you just did. Well, this is the Passover sacrifice that God told us to which is actually not the answer that's given in the Haggadah. Right? In the Haggadah, the answer to the wicked child's question is by saying, how dare you say us, me, rather than all of us, right? Because I guess you wouldn't have been going free if you were there.
You have that attitude.
Which is not found objectively within this text, right? It is subjective, which means that when a child asks you, what does this mean to you? There are ways for them to ask that are perfectly fine and reasonable and that deserve this type of answer. And there are also ways that they can ask it that are obnoxious, right? When the kid says, what does this mean to you? Why do you do this? That's very different than, why do you do this, right? Even with the same words, the intonation or the context or the history of dealing with this particular child will color how we answer. Sometimes wrongly, we'll assume the worst, but also sometimes correctly. We will know that the answer they need is not just, well, this is the Pesach offering. They know what it is. If they're asking with that tone of voice, they need to be told that this is a part of our liberation. So those whole 4 children archetypes that are found within the Haggadah are not meant to be taken as Jungian archetypes of limited structure, that if they ask this question, then you give this answer. They are meant to be illustrative, and individual children will vary. Much more we could say about the four sons, but for the moment, I want to focus on what we actually have now established as part of this rite. Right? We've got the lamb that we talk about. We don't do that anymore. We've got the matzah, which we talk about and eat, which we still have. And we have the maror, the bitter herbs, which we talk about and eat, which is also going to tell us one of the things we do on this Seder is talk. You'll notice we're not being told you will eat and eat and eat and go to bed. We're being told you're going to have to talk about this. You're going to have to discuss this, because your kids are going to want to know what this all means. And you can't just say, shut up and eat. Eat your bitter herbs, eat your lamb, eat your matzah. You have to explain to them why we're doing this. In fact, the Torah will tell us that we need to explain the Exodus 4 times before the Torah is finished, which is not a surprise nor a mistake, right? The 4 questions, or the four children that we have in the Haggadah are referring to the 4 times the Torah commands us to teach what the Exodus is all about, and the fact that the way we teach it will need to vary, which is why the Torah never explains it quite the same in each of those 4 times. Make sense? Okay, but this one thing, before we get to the big talk, that is confusing for a lot of people. And by confusing, I mean confusing for the Ashkenazim. And that is the odd one out of there, the part that people don't often understand, the maror. Matzah, most people understand how to make matzah, right? If I were to ask you, how would you make matzah? What basic instructions would you give me?
Flour and water.
Flour and water. Flour has to come from one of the 5 grains. That's no problem. Flour, water, you do it fast. You've made matzah. No problem. Maror. What's maror?
We've been using horseradish.
We've been using horseradish. What a wonderfully diplomatic answer. We've been using horseradish. Does that mean you've been doing the mitzvah or not doing the mitzvah?
My Seder plate has 2 places that, I wonder, what are they for? Carpus, okay. So what's the other one? So somebody said to me, oh, on that one, you put a green that is not sweet. Maybe they said, romaine to be sweet. What do I know? And that would be dip in salt water. What do we do with it?
So why do we have horseradish? We're going to find out today. right? Because, and I don't mean to alarm anyone here, if you are only eating horseradish as your bitter herb, not adequately fulfilling the commandment of eating bitter herbs. One of the things you'll notice very prominently in the English translation of this is the word herb. Horseradish ain't an herb, right? It's a root. Horseradish is a root. Would anybody here call a potato an herb? No. Would anyone here call a carrot an herb? No. You might call the leaves of the carrot an herb. You might call the leaves of a potato plant an herb, you know, as a leafy kind of thing. But you would not call the actual root an herb.
No.
But you call it a condiment.
We can call it a condiment, but no one actually says you should have mustard as your bitter herb. So we're going to find out, first of all, what really counts as a bitter herb. And then we're going to talk about a little bit how we ended up with horseradish as our de facto bitter herb for so many Jewish communities. All right, so we are on the front of the page that begins with said Rav Rahumi to Abaye. Would you mind continuing to read?
Sure. Made to Abaye. Is that Abaye?
Abaye.
Abaye, excuse me. On what basis do we know that the reference to bitter from Exodus means an herb?
Right, because if you go back and look at our verse, it doesn't have the equivalent Hebrew word for herb. It just says maror, which means bitter thing. And you might then assume that bitter thing could be anything that was bitter, right? All right, which we're going to get a few examples of.
Maybe it's gallbladder of a shabuta fish.
Which apparently, I have never had myself, but apparently is a particular piece of this fish that if you eat it, wow, is it bitter, right? But it's a bit of fish guts, which you can probably imagine some parts of the fish gut are probably pretty nasty. And that would be bitter. So if God told us to eat something bitter, how do we know it's not just a bit of bitter fish? Well,
it must be comparable to unleavened bread. Just as unleavened bread is from wheat, grows in the earth, so this bitter must be something that grows in the earth.
Right, because remember, we had as our pairing that we had unleavened bread and maror. We have matzah and maror. So if we've got matzah and maror, then maror must be something comparable to matzah. And therefore, since matzah it grows from the ground, so too maror grow from the ground. All right, so we've got our first criteria. How do we know what we need to have? So far, horseradish might be it, right? Horseradish definitely grows. Onward.
Well then, let's say it is a shrub with bitter leaves, for example, oleander, which is poisonous.
Well, you know,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
they were of limited botanical knowledge back then. They knew a lot more about some things than we did.
They should have asked
They,
me.
yeah, right. I think
It must be.
And I should also point out that sometimes the English translations of Talmud should not reflect upon the original meaning of that word. So just because over the centuries that word in Aramaic came to be the oleander, doesn't mean that's what, if we went back, Abaye would have pointed at and said, this is what we're eating, right? So the translations can sometimes be misleading.
It must be comparable to unleavened bread. Just as unleavened bread is a species of plant, so this bitter must be a species of plant and not a tree.
Judaism makes a very sharp distinction between something that grows from an annual type of growth and something that grows from it's there until that thing dies kind of growth. So when I pluck an apple from a tree, I say, Borei Peri Ha'etz. I say, God created the fruit of the tree. And when I pluck a carrot from the ground, I say, Borei Peri Ha'adama, that God created the fruit from the earth. Because that carrot plant is not going to be there next year unless I replant it. Whereas that apple tree will be. Wheat or other forms of the 5 species of grain, those are something that have to be tended and planted annually. Therefore, what we're eating that's bitter has to be something that is, whether planted or wild, is grown magic behind that. Make sense?
That it might be a single herb because the plural is used by Torah.
All right, so this debate is why didn't the Torah just say it is this. Why did the Torah say it is herbs? It is bitternesses. Why give us a plural? Why not just give us a definitive word? And the answer is given as well, the Torah didn't. Therefore, we cannot list one and only one species of food that will qualify as maror. There have to be more than one. Does that make sense so far?
Mhm.
Right? Since the Torah speaks in plural, no one can ever tell you there is only one thing that you can do maror with. There has to be at least more than one thing. Onward.
Why not say, since the plural is written, it must be one of two varieties. It must be comparable to unleavened bread. Just as unleavened bread may derive from many species, so the bitter here may derive from many species.
Right? We have 5 different species of grain that can become matzah, and therefore there needs to be multiple species that can become maror. Now, this is more than just a close reading of the Torah text to help us find out some of the parameters of maror. This is also a very important leniency, if you will, because although every community around the world was always expected to have at least one of the 5 grains in it, the different things that grow in different parts of the world are different when it comes to the herbs that you are able to get access to. Humans, at least historically, couldn't live without fairly stable gluten supply of glutinous carbohydrates, right? But long before they became the greatest, points, this was what people ate everywhere around the world. And it was the fact that we could grow these types of domesticated grains that allowed civilization to even exist. So that everybody knew would be available. But the particular varieties of herb type plants, that was a little bit more locally variant. And so you might not have much luck. So what was probably the most common form of maror in ancient Israel was in fact the chazeret, was in fact lettuce. Now, the romaine lettuce is the technical name for the lettuce that was most likely used back in the ancient world for that. But there's a problem with romaine lettuce today, which is it's not bitter, or at least very, very, very gently bitter only when you get down near the rootstock. And that's because of selective breeding. Right? We have bred our lettuces sweet, or at least bland. We have made sure that most of our herbal type things that we get in the supermarket have as little bitterness as possible. And we've achieved that over the last 2,000 years of being very, very careful about which plants breed with which plants in order to try and steer them away from bitterness, because guess what? Nobody likes eating bitter food. It is just one of those human things. We just don't like bitterness. So nowadays, most romaine lettuce, while still technically the right species that was used in the ancient world, unless you're really getting to the base or getting something that is not one of these modern varieties, is probably going to lack the kick that makes you feel that you're eating bitter herbs. So that's probably why you were a little surprised when someone suggested eating romaine, correct?
Right.
Exactly. Now, some health food stores, you can find it. But what you can find more commonly in health food stores that will even have a greater kick of bitterness nowadays, that were also mentioned in different ancient texts, are things like endives. Endives are very common and very good for doing maror with. Arugula will also work. Dandelion is also mentioned by some sources. So those are things that you're not going to find usually at Publix, but you can definitely find them at Whole Foods, which I walk into once a year in order to find maror, because I'm not going to find it in most of the other shops. How are we doing? Now, this idea that not having a definitive list, because the list needs to vary by country, is going to lead us towards how we end up dealing with horseradish when we come to Europe. But first, we need to get a little bit from the 1100s and 1200s. If you could continue with that middle paragraph, when horseradish.
When horseradish is first mentioned by local name in rabbinic literature, it is as an ingredient in haroset and not maror. Haroset is supposed to be the antidote to bitterness of maror, after all. It's ravioli's been a ton of mains, and raviolis are worms, so said.
Right. So when we first hear the idea of this thing that we call horseradish, the first time it gets mentioned, it's in the haroset, right? That apple mixture that gets used as well on Pesach. That was one of the things that in some parts of Europe, they added as an ingredient to haroset, which means that in their mind, it was not bitter. And if you think about it, if someone asked you, without Passover as a context, please describe the flavor of horseradish, you would say?
Bitter.
Bitter?
I would.
Pungent.
You've never eaten anything bitter then.
You would say it's hot.
It's hot, it's spicy, it's pungent, right? It's sharp. It is, it goes up your nose, right? That's not technically bitter, right? Because we don't associate bitterness with spiciness, right? If someone eats Tabasco, you wouldn't say that was bitter. If someone was to eat wasabi, which is a Japanese horseradish, you wouldn't say that was bitter. We've been kind of conditioned in the Jewish world to call horseradish bitter because it's stuck in the dish that says bitter on it. But that doesn't mean it actually tastes bitter. Go eat the gallbladder of a fish, that's bitter. Not for Pesach, but that will give you a feeling for bitter. Eat some straight arugula or dandelion or endives, and then compare it to horseradish. And you'll see that they are very different flavors. The same way that people will happily sprinkle horseradish onto their roast beef or add other spicy condiments to other food and not call it bitter, but simply call it tasty and flavorful, is the same reason that horseradish is not really a good approximate for bitterness for the Seder plate. Make sense? Okay, so now that we know that horseradish is more at home in the haroset rather than the maror, how did it end up becoming maror? And is it even permissible? Keep going.
Well, only the leaves and stalk of the plant may be used. The root is not permissible.
All right, go ahead and read the next one as well.
The leaves or stalk of the horseradish may be used, but not the root.
So as horseradish began to be used in certain parts of Europe, this controversy became very, if you'll pardon the expression, heated. Right? It was a spicy debate of whether or not you were allowed to use it. And the rabbinic authorities at the time routinely and almost universally pointed out that based on not only our section of the Talmud, but other parts of the Mishnah and Talmud, that when it comes time for making the bitter herb, it's got to be the leafy part, not the root part. That it has to actually be something that's growing above ground, not the thing that's growing in the ground. And so they said, oh, well, if you want to eat horseradish leaves, excuse me. I can leave a message and I'll call them back. You can eat the horseradish leaves, but you can't eat the horseradish root as far as your maror goes. That was the compromise in certain communities to this growing trend of eating horseradish. Now, why was horseradish becoming more and more popular? Simply because as Jews moved more from the Southern European areas into Northern or Eastern European, the botany was different, right? The flora was not the same.
Look at the next comment, though. From a gardener, that's important.
Well, we're going to get to that in just a second, but that's already after the fact, right? Because in the intervening times between somewhere in the 1100s and somewhere in the 1800s, most of the Jews have been pushed further and further east and north. So you now have Jews living in Poland and Lithuania and Latvia, Romania, and Russia. Those areas did not have the same flora as the areas of France and southern or Spain or northern Italy and those. This is now getting to be a much colder, a much later and longer winter. And in fact, by the time spring comes around, that is to say spring officially, it doesn't mean that it feels like spring if you're living in the middle of Estonia. It, in fact, probably feels still a little bit like the tinge of winter, which means most of the things growing up out of the ground aren't growing yet. The things underground are still there. And so the eating of horseradish was possibly also because it was simply much easier to get that flavorful root than it was to find leaves that could substitute in those new areas that we lived in. Having done that and becoming the new tradition, then you get justifications. And this is where we come to Chatan Sofer.
Horseradish may be preferable to lettuce, given how difficult it is to clean lettuce of insects.
All right, so this is what's known as post hoc justification. Now that we're using horseradish regularly, let's not only say we're using it because we don't have the right kind of leaves, let's say that it's better to use it than other things and come up with an explanation. So Chatan Sofer said that horseradish was better to use, and he's talking about the root, because, lettuce, sometimes there are bugs on it. It's much harder to wash and clean. So better to be safe and eat this other thing than potentially eat the leaves that have bugs on them. Now notice what's happened here. The actual mitzvah is to eat an herb, is to eat the leaf thing. Because of necessity, we developed a practice of eating this root because there really wasn't something comparable in those particular areas. Remember, we're talking about not things like bushes that are there all year. We're talking about things that have to grow from scratch each year. And they simply were not growing in those areas in the quantity or availability that was necessary. Having made that concession because of our geography, we now come full circle when we are put back in a place where we have more transportation of more types of food and better types of growing techniques, of saying, do we change the tradition we have now developed? And Hatam Sofer comes along in the 1800s when the reform movement is saying, we change everything we want to change, and says change of any of our traditions is bad. But he has to come up with an explanation of why we shouldn't change back to using by every standard, preferable leaves from other plants. And so the explanation is kashrut. And it's easier to find kosher roots than it is to find kosher leaves. Now, does that mean no one ever ate lettuce in the Orthodox world after this point on? Of course not. They absolutely eat lettuce, but this is a way of justifying the maintenance of a tradition in the face of other changes. And Hatam Sofer and other Orthodox leaders in the 1800s did not want to make any changes, even legitimate ones, in the face of the tidal wave of change that was coming from other members of the Jewish world. Make sense? Which means that now, in the 21st century, you still find people trapped into using horseradish as the only condiment that they will use for their maror, even though they are not Orthodox, even though they're not interested in any of these other issues, and even though there's a place for lettuce on the plate, because tradition dies hard, even when the tradition was born because of hard conditions. And even though we now live in places where there are stores like Whole Foods, where you can easily go and spend a lot of money to buy things you would never normally eat, but you can do so for Pesach, many people still cling to the tradition because they don't understand the tradition was only made because there was a flaw in the geography of where we had been forced to live. If you go to a Sephardic Seder, you will not find horseradish on the table. If you go to a Mizrahi Seder, you will not find horseradish on the table. And there is a growing trend, even among many Ashkenazim, Orthodox even, to say, you know what, we should be getting back to this leaf. Because really, it is a mitzvah. And the best way to do a mitzvah is to do it in the way that our Jewish law actually told us to do it, rather than just in the way that we were left doing it because of external problems. And that means get yourself some leaves.
You can get dandelion leaves in your backyard if you have not been keeping up with spraying and all the rest of it, and if you don't have a lot of dogs around.
And you know what to look for. Right.
Yeah.
Right. I am not encouraging people to eat random plants in their backyard.
Right.
That would not be a good idea. In fact, it's ironic you would say that. I was just listening to a historical podcast about one of the major revolutions in China during the time of British occupation and the opium issues. And the leader, who was a religious leader who had taken on the mantle of believing that he was the younger brother of Jesus. This is a Chinese man. And when they were finally about to collapse in upon themselves under siege by the rest of the army, and they had no food, he said, it's okay, God will turn anything we eat into food. And he reached down, picked up a weed and ate it, and it turned out to be a deadly poison, and he dropped dead. So do not eat plants that you are not sure are edible. So if you are 100% sure it's dandelion, by all means, go ahead. But if you're not, go to the supermarket.
Slightly off the subject. Okay, we're not marking our doorposts with the blood of the Paschal lamb.
No, we're not.
Do we mark our doorsteps of our doorpost with mezuzah? Is that a transfer of marking?
No, it is actually not connected to the Passover offering at all. It is instead a fulfillment of the section that we read in Ve'ahavta, where it says that you will write these words on the doorposts of your house, so that they will be a reminder when we go and when we come of God and God's teachings.
But isn't it also a reminder of the Exodus?
There is,
Of marking the house, so our house is different from the other houses?
well, we're not actually doing it to say that we're different from the other houses, right? That particular marking is not about identifying us differently. It has that as a secondary effect, but that is not one of its purposes, right? The purpose is to remind us not of the Exodus, but to remind us of God and to remind us of Torah and to remind us whether we're home or whether we're leaving home of how we are supposed to be behaving. So it has a very different effect. And secondly, the doorposts blood from the lamb had almost a prophylactic, ambulatory type sensation to it, that this was marking our house in order that we be skipped from the plague that was striking. Whereas the mezuzah has no protective power at all. It was only very recently that some particular sects of Judaism began to peddle that particular superstition. But absolutely nowhere in traditional Jewish law does it say that the mezuzah is somehow a magic charm that is providing any sort of protection. And God did not instruct us to have a mezuzah as though it were a charm. And so we use it as a reminder of our connection to God, not of this particular night. You're welcome. All right. What do we use, though, as a reminder of the Exodus? Well, there are many different parts of the Seder where we get those reminders, but the one that is skipped most frequently in most homes is the idea that my father was a wandering Aramean, or my father was attacked by an Aramean. There's a great debate on how to translate that particular word into Hebrew. That section of the Midrash is the section that I think is voted most likely not to be read in many homes. And it's a shame, because it is a beautiful classic example of how Midrash works, of how Judaism reads texts by saying, here's a word or here's a couple words, and this is what they actually mean, as opposed to just reading it as though it were a paragraph. So this section, which is taken from the book of Deuteronomy, 26, 5 through 10, is used when somebody would bring their first fruit offerings to Jerusalem, and this was the formula they would recite. The rabbis selected it because it is perhaps the shortest and most succinct summary of our history, as being the core of how we would retell the story, but as the starting point, not the end point. And in order to make sure that was clear, our current Haggadah uses this section and then gives us pointers of how you should interpret each of the lines and each of the words. That doesn't mean, again, that all you have to do is sit and read. You are supposed to sit, read, and discuss. Going back to the talk idea that we were told that it was part of what our Seder was meant to be after that first night. I mean, after the first night, we didn't have a whole lot to talk about other than what do you want to do when we get out of here? Once we were out of there, then we had to talk about what it all meant. Good. So we're going to go through it, and I'm going to hopefully help you get more out of this section, and maybe you'll think of including it when you get to your Seder this coming Friday and Saturday night. So we're going to play a little bit of what was the right word? A duet. So if you could read the parts on the left, I will then jump in with the rabbinic interpretation on the right. Good?
Good.
Okay.
My father was a wandering Aramean.
So there's nothing actually written specifically for that, but I should point out that this was considered to be a beginning with disgrace. That the idea was we were unsettled, we had no place that was called our home, we were under possible persecution. This is trying to remind us that even before we got to the Exodus, even before we got to Egypt, things weren't so great.
We were nomads.
We were, and being a nomad, really, in comparison to being settled and knowing where your food's coming from, being a nomad's no picnic.
No, following your flocks.
Hmm.
And he went down to Egypt.
All right, compelled by divine decree. So what are the rabbis trying to remind us here is that going down to Egypt wasn't just a vacation choice, that this was something that we wouldn't have done if God had not told Jacob, it's okay, take your family, go down there and be able to live.
And sojourned there.
All right, and the sojourn, not a common modern English word, but sojourn means to temporarily live, which is why the rabbis say he did not come down to settle in Egypt, but only to live there temporarily. As it is written, they said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in this land because there is no pasture for your servants' flocks. for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. For now, though, let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen.
With a few people,
With 70 souls, point out the rabbis, your ancestors went down to Egypt, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky. So we're not only hearing about interpreting the past, but in the interpretation of the past, we get echoes of the future and present so that this stays relevant and living to the people who are discussing it.
and became a great nation.
They became a distinct people in Egypt. Now, you might be surprised that the interpretation doesn't emphasize the greatness of the nation, but what they are pointing out is that we went down as a family and we became a people, that we didn't just blend into the Egyptians and we didn't just stay family clans. We became something that would be recognized as an as a nation, and that was a distinctiveness that has continued till this day.
Powerful.
The children of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and became mighty, and the land was full of them. So how do we define power?
Numbers.
Numbers. Because for most of human history, that was the definition of power. Nowadays, we might say that there are other ways of being powerful, but in the ancient world, the way you measured the power of a nation was by how many people were in the nation, because that told you how many soldiers you might have.
And numerous.
And numerous as it is written, I made you as populous as the plants of the field. You grew up and wore choice adornments. Your breasts were firm and your hair grew long, yet you were bare and naked.
The Egyptians.
Sorry, that should continue.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know, the printer didn't help.
The Egyptians suspected us of evil.
Okay, so why does this go wrong? Well, the Egyptians said, let us deal with them wisely, lest they multiply. And if we happen to be at war, they may join our enemies and fight against us and then leave the country. So notice their suspicion of evil is not because we have done anything other than prosper. Right? We have not given them any indication. We have not allied with any of their enemies. We have not done anything that was destructive to Egyptian culture or politics. But simply by existing, we are considered to be a threat. And so in order to remove that threat, they begin to persecute us. By the way, this is what is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy, because by persecuting us, they create the conditions that will lead eventually to Moses and the redemption, through which, unfortunately, Egypt will suffer greatly. Were you going to add something? Or,
No,
good?
that's right, okay.
Okay. And
made us suffer.
they set taskmasters over them in order to oppress them with their burdens. The people of Israel built Pitom and Ramses as store cities for the Pharaoh. Please never let me hear you think that Jews built the pyramids, right? Historically, the pyramids were already old by the time we got to Egypt, on the order of 1,000 to 2,000. So they were already ancient before we showed up. We did not build the pyramids, despite what you may see in illustrations around the world or hear people say. We built lots of other stuff with the Egyptians, not the pyramids.
Subjecting us to harsh labor.
They imposed back-breaking labor upon the people of Israel.
Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors.
We cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, as it is written. It happened in the course of the many days that the king of Egypt died. The children of Israel sighed because of their labor and cried. Their cry of servitude reached God.
And the Lord heard our voice.
God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So again, it's not just that God heard us and said, oh, I better go help. It was also part of the fulfillment of what we should have known because of the promise God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it also explains why we're crying out to God, because we are recalling that there is God who had made this promise to our ancestors.
And saw our misery.
And saw our affliction. That is, the conjugal separation of husband and wife, as it is written, God saw the children of Israel and God knew. Right? So there was a midrash idea that's implied here that when the killing of the boys was taking place, that the men and women of Israel separated from themselves voluntarily so that they would not make any more babies that could then be killed. That eventually, of course, had to be overturned. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, because if you don't have any babies, you end up with a population problem. But that's what that's a reference to.
Toil.
Our toil refers to the drowning of the sons. As it is written, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, but you shall let every daughter live. So again, the word toil you might have thought was just another phrase for work. We've already talked about our work. and therefore this particular form of oppression must be referring to something else.
And oppression.
Our oppression means the pressure used upon them, as it is written, I have also seen how the Egyptians are oppressing them, meaning that oppression is not just the work that we were made to do, but sometimes how we were made to do it, that there are ways of cajoling people to do labor, even if it's something that's extracted from them as some sort of burden. But there are other ways that you get that same result that are more violent or oppressive.
So the Lord brought us out of Egypt.
The Lord brought us out of Egypt, not by an angel, not by a seraph, not by a messenger, but by the Holy One, blessed be he himself, as it is written, I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night. I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from man unto beast. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, myself and not an angel. I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, myself and not a seraph. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment, myself and not a messenger. I am the Lord and none other. They've got to make it clear who was doing the job. Right? And again, this is an important point. The fact that God brought us out of Egypt, you might just think is, oh, we had the Exodus. But it's God brought us out of Egypt. And again, teaching us where to put the emphasis in a particular sentence.
With a mighty hand.
Mighty hand refers to disease among the cattle, as it is written, behold, the hand of the Lord strikes your cattle, which are in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks, with a very severe pestilence.
And an outstretched arm.
Outstretched arm means sword. Drawn sword is in his hand, outstretched over Jerusalem.
With great awe.
This alludes to the divine revelation. As it is written, has God ever attempted to take to himself a nation from the midst of another nation by trials, miraculous signs and wonders, by warring with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, and by awesome revelations, just as you saw the Lord your God do for you in Egypt before your eyes? So although we may tend to think of revelation as being something that was focused on Mount Sinai, where indeed the Torah was, this is trying to tell us that God's existence and God's will is being revealed by the entire Exodus endeavor.
And with signs.
This refers to the miracles performed with the staff of Moses, as it is written, take the staff in your hand that you may perform the miraculous signs with it.
And wonders.
Brought us up to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, okay, this seems to have cut off the last line. Deuteronomy to refresh yourself on this, but basically now I'm bringing what I have grown in order to be thankful. So the final line of this is the statement that was made by the person of Israel later in the centuries, who would be bringing it. So imagine if you were familiar with this phrase, this entire paragraph, as being what someone would say when they came to Jerusalem, gratitude for the gift that God had given them of the land, that they would not only be saying, thank God for the land, but to say, thank God for the freedom to be able to work the land and for everything that was done for us that lifted us up from being wandering Arameans to be able to be a nation in our own land with milk and honey, and to get to this point to offer up this gratitude, which is meant to be during this retelling. We're not just trying to say it was bad, and God did good stuff. We are supposed to be seeing the consequences of what God has given us so that we can feel gratitude for everything that we are now enjoying. So when you finish the retelling, it should feel personal to the point of, this is what God did, which is why I now sit at this table with you folks, my friends, or my family at your Seder, or with this particular food that we're able to eat, or in this house that we're able to take shelter. You're supposed to tie everything that you now experience into all of the experiences of antiquity. Make sense? Right? It's not just a boring story. It's meant to lift us up through those centuries all the way down to us today. And that is something that only happens if you actually talk about it.
We'll talk about it. Talking about signs and wonders. We're all here.
Mm-hmm.
I sat down randomly. I'm not usually able to come on Wednesday. I have a conflict. I had this book here. I looked in the book, and guess what? This book was presented to Temple Israel by Natalie Freilich, happens to be Helen Hosted's sister,
Mm.
in memory of Robert Weinrich, who was my husband.
Wow.
So I think it's a sign I was meant to be here today. Unless you can interpret it otherwise.
Well, at the very least, to sit in that chair.
Yeah.
The mystery is too
I hope
great.
Helen Hosted is doing well.
Last I heard, she's been holding steady. No.
Well, you kind of wonder about things.
Like
Why
that.
am
Right.
I here? Why
Like
is
things.
this book here? I know
I
Natalie
put that
Pryor,
book here.
nobody here knows.
But the thing you have
And
to,
my husband died 20 years ago,
Hmm.
and here is his name. Of course, I think of him every day. Huh, how did that happen?
but more to the point, that particular coincidence, if you will, would only have been noticed and realized as being wondrous because you have the habit of looking at the front of the book because you know that these books have all been dedicated and donated by members of the community in honor or in memory of loved ones.
Oh, yes, it's true.
Without that sensitivity to know that it matters that someone donated this book, that it matters that someone cared enough to make sure these would be here for our congregation.
But
You
what
would never
is not
have been-
clear is why don't they have it? And so I have some, how did it come to me?
But you're missing that you would not have known that it came to
I
you
know,
without
so I
looking.
looked, I'm aware.
And that's something that too often we say, why are there no miracles? Why are there no wonders?
We just
Are
don't
you
know.
actually looking?
We're not paying
Are you
attention.
sensitive to the idea that there may be something? Or just sensitive in general to, you know what? I always like to know who helped our community. And by having that attitude, you open yourself up to witnessing some of the little treats that God has in store for us. With that, a Chag Sameach and a Shabbat Shalom, it should not be forgotten. And I'll see you all next week. Take care.
Thank you.